As everybody gets settled, we'll go ahead and get started. Come on down. You just come on down as you get settled around up there. Good evening. I'm Jonathan Simon. I serve the university as both the director of the Center for Global Health and Development, a university-wide center. And I also serve the university as chair of the Department of International Health at the BU School of Public Health. And I want to welcome people and thank them for spending some time with us tonight to both acknowledge an extraordinary anniversary. And one wonders whether we should be celebrating or a more somber event. And I think we actually have a bit of both, because we live in an extraordinary time. We live in a time that history books will tell us was a time of plague. And usually when we think about plague, we think of other historical eras and moments. But I believe that when the historians look back at this period of 1980s and forward, because our plague we don't actually have the end date for yet. Mrs. Clinton's optimistic speech 2 weeks ago notwithstanding. The fact of the matter is we live in quite an extraordinary time of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, one that I think the history books will note as quite an epic, quite a time. And we're here tonight because, in fact, it is 30 years ago now that the CDC Mortality Weekly Report put together the information on the cases that had been identified of a strange disease that was killing primarily men at that time that was of undetermined origin. And over that extraordinary 30 years, we've had some extraordinary progress. We now have 5 million people on treatment and have turned what was a death sentence into a chronic disease. We've discovered a tremendous amount about immunology. We've discovered a tremendous amount about this virus. We've discovered a tremendous amount about ourselves as a human race and a population. Some of that quite empowering and quite noble, and some of that, frankly, quite disturbing and quite challenging. And the focus of tonight is to allow 4 of our colleagues, each of whom in some way has had their professional life captured by this plague, by this HIV/AIDS pandemic, to really do something which we don't often do, which is not review the scientific literature on the newest treatment approach or how we doing on circumcision or combination therapy, but to actually give some personal reflections on their work, but more importantly on how this disease has affected their life. All right? And there'll be lots of science over the rest of the week on NPR and other media sources as we sort of reflect back on this both acknowledgement of 30 years of this particular historic plague, but also celebrating the progress we've made as we lead towards the United States hosting the next AIDS conference next June, correct? July, and it's next summer. So what I'd like to do with those brief introductory remarks is to introduce our 4 respondents. The structure of the evening will be that I will ask each of them to take 10 or 12 minutes and comment on their own reflections upon their experience with the pandemic. And then we'll open it up for comments, questions, discussion, and whatnot. So with that, welcome again. Let me introduce our respondents. And we'll go in the order in which you've agreed to speak. The first one, Dr. Donald Thea, it's always really, really hard to introduce one of your closest colleagues, because do you tell the backstory or do you do the formal presentation of Don's scientific career and progress? But for anyone who would like the backstory introduction, I'll meet you in the hallway afterwards. Don has been working on HIV/AIDS throughout his professional career. He's trained as a physician from Columbia University's medical school, and then did training in tropical health and hygiene, tropical medicine at the London School. And if my history and memory is correct, he wanted to work on malaria at the London School, right? So didn't go to the London School to learn about HIV because his training at the London School was actually pre-epidemic.
Chest post.
Yeah, right? He then came back and did specialty training in infectious diseases at Tufts New England Medical Center. And that's actually where I first came about him, because some of Don's early work was on diarrheal diseases and how were diarrheal diseases affecting this population in Zaire that clearly was immune compromised. So when I first met Don, he was the really smart lab rat with the blender working on doo-doo, okay? Right? Through some collaborations here in Boston, I started recruiting Don. It took me, I think, 4 years of courtship in order to get him to join our group. He's played hard to get. We finally did get him to join us at our previous institutional base at the Harvard Institute for International Development. And Don and I have been together working at the center now for the 10 years we've been here at Boston University. Don was resident in Zaire when some of the first clinical trials around HIV populations were put together in what the history books will say was one of the most productive field sites in the early stages of the epidemic, as people were trying to get a handle on this high fatality disease that was really at that time, or pre-treatment at that time, really ravishing African populations. Post-Zaire, Don ran the perinatal transmission program in New York City, and then from New York City we were able to get him to join us here in Boston. So I welcome you, Don. The second colleague here is Dr. Martha Vibert, and BMC has a number of gems, just totally fantastic niches of service and thoughtfulness and caring, and the Sparks Center is one of those gems. Because the Sparks Center is an offshoot of the fact that in the early days of the pandemic, Boston Medical Center was the treatment facility for children. Before we had a lot of services for children, before we had good therapeutic, and sort of the pediatric AIDS clinic was here, and we had a pediatric AIDS population that this medical center was serving. But one of our successes is we don't have a pediatric AIDS service at BMC. Why? Because we figured out how to keep these children from dying. And in fact, that patient population dried up. But the success, as is often the case, the success puts into place the next set of responsibilities. And the responsibilities were for those school-age children and then those adolescent children who were the long-term survivors. The children that the technology had saved. And Martha runs a center which is focused on that patient population, which is a very interesting patient population to serve. She also has clinical faculty appointments in both pediatrics and psychiatry. She's trained as a clinical psychologist and has become increasingly involved with the work of the center around issues of disclosure. When do you disclose to children? How do you disclose to children? Who tells children? How do you tell, and how do they maintain their well-being? So Martha, you're welcome. The third introduction is Professor Lisa Messersmith, who's an associate professor both here in the Department of International Health, but a joint appointment with anthropology. She's trained as a medical anthropologist and has really built a long career dealing with commercial sex workers and women who increasingly the world recognized were bearing a disproportionate burden of the pandemic. And if you get involved in those issues, you very quickly get involved in human rights issues, marginalized population issues, women's health and women's control over their health, and has been with the center now for 5 years or so, about 4 or 5 years. Yeah, going on 5. Sort of bringing that perspective and bringing those particular high-risk populations into our research portfolio. She's been resident in multiple places in the world, was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, right? Before living for some years in Asia, so brings a lot of rich field experience to bear both in our classrooms and our research program. So welcome. And the last introduction I'd like to make is Reverend Ted Karpf, whose faculty appointment is in the School of Theology. But he's actually a returnee to Boston in some ways, because Ted went off and he basically worked with the global AIDS response as the person responsible in UNAIDS for their partnership program. And for those of you that have followed the sort of programmatic initiatives of how the globe has responded to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, community-based groups, particularly faith-based community groups, are an important part of the global response. And I think Ted was crucial in having the clinical community and the sort of health policy community, which might be policy analysts and economists and other people, realize that the forward edge of the response actually had to be in community-based groups, and in particularly welcoming the faith-based communities into the global response, and played, I think, a leading role in helping that consciousness and that understanding be brought to bear in global programming, which early on was being appropriately captured by guys who look like Don Thea, you know, clinical ID, but in fact, in order for the Don Theas of the world to be effective, they need the Ted Karpfs to get right. There's the public health perspective on this. He's also the author of a book which he just was kind enough to give me a copy on, called Restoring Hope, Decent Care in the Midst of HIV/AIDS. And I think that's been one of the challenges of the past 30 years, to take a disease which is really a very difficult disease, and to both provide decent care, provide dignity, and for those who die of it, to provide a dignified end-of-life experience from what is, in fact, a very difficult disease. So Ted, thank you. And with that sort of introduction of our 4 respondents, I will sit back and give it to you, Don, to say, so malaria didn't capture you, huh?
No, it didn't. Thank you, John. In the 15 minutes that we have left after that long introduction, I'll try to describe a little bit of my reflections. It's interesting to be sitting here and being asked to reflect on 30 years of work in HIV and not to talk about the science, because usually when I have lights in my face and I have a microphone to talk into, I'm talking about science. So it's interesting not to do that. What I'd like to do is sort of give you a sense of where I started and where I've come over the course of a 30-year career in HIV care and HIV research. And in that, tell a story that really is a story of, usually you say, hope and despair, but it really is a story of despair and hope. And I want to also talk a little bit about stigma in that regard. And as John mentioned, I was a student at Columbia and that university in New York City. And in 1981, I graduated and got onto the wards of a hospital in Manhattan in July. And it was in June that report came out in the MMWR about this group of men in Los Angeles who were noted to have a strange kind of a pneumonia and a strange kind of skin cancer. And I remember being on the wards and talking with our team and seeing these men come in with this strange cancer that was characteristic of elderly Jewish men in Eastern Europe. And these were strong, strapping, vital young men who were manifesting this disease. And we didn't have a clue about what was going on. And it I knew at that point that I was interested in infectious diseases, and part of the reason I was interested in infectious diseases was because amongst the medical specialties, it was one of the specialties where you could intervene and do something and have that individual walk out of the hospital in the same shape that they walked in. I had an early experience with a construction worker who sat down during the coffee break at 10 o'clock and was feeling a little bit ill, and by the time his friends noticed 15 minutes later, he was nearly comatose, brought to the hospital, and he had meningitis. We were able to diagnose it quickly, treat him, and 6 days later, he walked out of the hospital as good as before he got sick. Turned me on tremendously, and I thought, this is the thing for me. However, while I was going through that process on the wards and noticing that there were these young men who were dying of what appeared to be an infectious disease, but we weren't sure at the time, it consumed us, because this was totally out of the ordinary. It was something that we really had no idea what it was about, and then it just blossomed. And it became something that everybody talked about, that was affecting everybody's lives. When I was in New York, I was married to an actress, and her entire world started to fall apart because all of the gay men in the theater district and in the theater business started to fall. And there were in the 3 years that I was an intern and a resident at that hospital in New York City, I pronounced dead 6 individuals who were friends of hers by going to the apartment because they knew it was inevitable. They wanted to die at home, and they didn't want to have to call emergency technicians and get the coroners involved. So I went to the home, pronounced them dead, and signed the death certificate. I can't describe to you the amount of fear and the amount of weight that was associated with this. So I, as John said, wanted to study malaria, wanted to study international health. Went through my internship and residency having seen this devastation begin to emerge. And just as I was leaving, there was a report that came out of Africa on Slim's disease, which was the manifestation of HIV in Africa. So I went to the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in 1984, got there prepared to study malaria, and I was interested to see that nobody was talking about HIV. And I remember being in the class and raising my hand and saying, you know, there's this report and this disease happening over in Africa. I think we ought to really talk about it in class. And I remember the instructor, who was a malariologist of a very advanced vintage, said, that's a disease of the developed world, that's a disease of gay men. Let's get back to the real important issues affecting Africa and the developing world, malaria and leishmaniasis and all of the rest of that stuff. And unfortunately, you know, my inclination was right, and it turned out to be, as we all know, a massively important epidemic. And as John said, I then came back and did my formal ID training at Tufts New England Medical Center, and then joined a project that was ongoing in Africa called Projet SIDA, which was the first international HIV/AIDS research, and it was in Kinshasa at Mamiema Hospital, which is a hospital that is as large as Bellevue, if you count the number of bodies, but it had, I think, a third the number of beds as Bellevue Hospital, because people would be hospitalized, and there would be 2 and 3 people to a bed. And we started to do diarrheal research there, and it was again a revelation for me to see how little could be done about this disease in that setting, and it was a stark reality. One of the things that also became clear to me was that if we were going to fight this disease, it wasn't going to be about drugs exclusively. It wasn't going to be about developing a vaccine exclusively. It was going to be about health systems, and it was going to be about looking at HIV in the context of the environment where it existed. And I have 2 anecdotes that I want to relate to you that really relate to that. And the first one was that Mamiama Hospital had a blood bank that was not secure at the time. So people would come and they'd donate a unit of blood, and that unit of blood, if it was being transfused into kids who would have a high degree of anemia because of malaria and various things, if that unit of blood was infected, it would be a 100% infection rate to those kids, and that 1 unit of blood could infect up to 20 children. So the German Development Agency came in and decided that they would provide testing for all of the units of blood that would come into the laboratory. And so they trained people up and supplied them, and then came back a few weeks later to try to assess what was going on. And it turns out that the rapid test that was being used for HIV was being used during the evening shift only a couple of times. And then the laboratory technicians were just randomly assigning an HIV positivity rate to that unit of blood, and then pocketing the rapid tests and selling them in the market. So it dawned on me that this is really a bigger issue in terms of health systems. The second anecdote has to do with what happened at the end of my tenure when I was in Zaire, and we were in the middle of doing a lot of research, and it was at a time when the dictator of Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko, had not paid his army for a number of months, and they decided that they would take their back pay in durable goods. So they went on a rampage and they rioted and essentially looted all of the homes in Kinshasa. And there was a laboratory next to the hospital where we worked, and in that laboratory there were some animals that were being kept, like sheep for sheep's blood, to make sheep's blood agar, and mice for some of the experiments that were being done. And there was a woman named Delphi, who subsequently wrote a book that I have here, who wanted to protect the laboratory. So there was this band of Zairians coming up the road, and they were looting everything in its way. So she decided that she would use stigma to protect the lab. And to give you an indication of how strong stigma was then, what she did is she went back to the laboratory, she slaughtered a sheep, and she bled the sheep, and she wrote on the wall of the entrance to this laboratory, SIDA, S-I-D-A, which is AIDS in French, on the door. And the crowd of thousands of Kinshasa residents were walking up the road, and they just walked right past the laboratory. They just completely avoided anything to do with the laboratory, which gives you an indication of how strong the stigma is. There's a picture on the back of this book of her lab workers and the door that she wrote that on, which I can pass around later. And then I continued to do work. We got evacuated out of Zaire, and then as John said, I continued to do work in New York City. And it was a time when there was one medication that we thought might be effective, and that was AZT. And from that point, all the way to the present, there has been a really remarkable series of scientific achievements with respect to this epidemic that has, in essence, eliminated mother-to-child transmission of HIV in developed countries. We've gotten to the point now where we have the tools so that we could actually eliminate mother-to-child transmission in developing countries, which is something that I never thought would have happened. We now have other examples of treatment and possible vaccines that really create a sense of hope in the public health and the scientific community in terms of really being able to turn the tide on this epidemic. And to be a part of that 30-year arc of going from despair to real hope at this point is a remarkable experience for a public health professional as well as a scientist to see the hard work really bear fruit, so that at this point we really have the tools to be able to make a huge difference in being able to deal with this disease. I don't know if people saw, but in the New York Times just yesterday, there was a report of a second person who has gotten genetic therapy that that knocked down their ability to make an HIV-infected individual got genetic therapy, knocked down their ability to actually replicate virus, and they are off medication with no detectable virus within their body. There's been incredible research recently on microbicides, which indicate that we might have actually been able, we're on the right track in terms of being able to give women a choice in interrupting heterosexual transmission. Male circumcision is an intervention that has been recently seen to be as effective, essentially, as a vaccine, if a vaccine were about 30 or 40% effective. A remarkable achievement. So we really are at a point where we've made major strides in dealing with this pandemic that for many years was devastating and absolutely frightening. And from my standpoint, looking back on it, it really is one of the most major achievements, I think, in the world of public health, applied public health research and science.
Thank you, Don.
Well, that was just fantastic to hear that arc and to hear it from the perspective, the public health and research perspective. I think the lens that I want to share with you is perhaps a more clinical one. As John said, I am a clinical psychologist, and I found myself in New York City in 1981, beginning graduate school in clinical psychology at New York University. And of course, you could not live in New York City in the 80s and not encounter this growing awareness of the AIDS epidemic. And for me, initially it took the shape of many of our gay friends becoming sick and dying. It was scary, it was horrifying. My husband was at NYU School of the Arts, where Tony Kushner, who wrote Angels in America, was beginning to write the first precursors to that play. So we were very much involved in the arts world and watching the impact emerge there. Of course, my own work was with children, and particularly with infants. I worked in an infant lab throughout graduate school. I was very, very interested in early development in infancy. And as it turned out, going through graduate school, I finished my degree and was immediately recruited by a young pediatrician up at Harlem Hospital to join a pediatric AIDS team that she was beginning to put together in the late 80s. And this was, for any of you who remember the name Ryan White, was in the wake of this young boy's tragic battle with HIV secondary to blood transfusion. And what was happening were babies were being born in urban epicenters around the country with a very serious illness that sometimes was not clear what was happening. And there needed to be a response. And there was, you know, by this time, an understanding of HIV, that it was of what AIDS was, but vertical transmission was virtually a puzzle. No one understood it. There was a great deal of interest in when was transmission happening, and how to diagnose children. It wasn't possible to diagnose an infant born with HIV until they were about 24 months. So you can imagine the agony for the medical teams trying to figure out what was going on with children. The other thing that has to be said, this is New York in the 80s. This is the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. And this created a synergistic effect of the HIV virus, because you had lots of women being put at risk, sometimes by their partners, sometimes because of drug use, and now becoming infected and unknowingly transmitting the virus during pregnancy. The way this looked clinically in an urban, under-resourced pediatric setting was that babies were being born. They were crack addicted or methadone addicted or heroin addicted. Their mothers were desperately sick and often outcast from their families. And the babies were languishing on inpatient settings. This was called the border baby crisis. So there was a great need to understand right at birth how these babies were looking, what was happening with their brain development, essentially, and could that be a clue to the early progression of HIV disease in childhood. And my colleague, Elaine Abrams, was very interested and very visionary in realizing that this was much more than a medical challenge. This was a psychosocial challenge of the highest degree, and that she needed to put together a diverse team, people who could bring different skill sets to the table. And here I was, my expertise was in evaluating whether a newborn baby could track a red ball or orient to a sound, and I found myself working with newborns in the neonatal intensive care unit at Harlem Hospital and helping the pediatric team begin to put together what was happening with children. We had some CDC funding, and we were trying to track, believe it or not, the prospective course of HIV disease in children. You have to picture the setting. We're 6 people working in essentially a room the size of a closet on a back ward up on the top floor of Harlem Hospital. It was a bizarre experience, in many ways like a MASH unit, because the fear around these babies, the stigma around the mothers was so great that many of the nurses refused to take care of the children. We found ourselves putting on gloves and doing what we could. It was quite the training for someone whose background was in psychology. It was very much about death and dying. It was helping families say goodbye to their children. It was trying to help children deal with illness, with confusion. But in the midst of it, it's also New York City, and there's a lot of buzz about what's happening. So the anecdote I want to tell you is the day that a black limousine pulled up to the front door of Harlem Hospital, and Princess Diana got out of the car, Lady Di, who, as you may or may not know, was one of the first people who really cast the public eye towards children and the epidemic. And she got out of the car, she came up to that closet where we tried to hide the garbage bags under the desk where we had all the old donated clothes and extra formula that we were giving out, and there, lo and behold, there she is. And she's gorgeous, and she's poised, and the cameras are clicking, and we're standing around. No one knew what to do. The children are running around the ward, and I watched her seek out. She scanned the horizon of that floor, and she picked out a child, and I knew this child because I was working with him very closely. He had galloping HIV encephalopathy. He had lost the capacity to speak. The only words he had left were 4-letter words. He was sick. He was not a particularly attractive child. He was struggling with neuropathy. He was really in a lot of pain. She scanned that horizon, and she went for that child. And she bent down, and she picked him up, and she put his face right against her cheek, like this. And the cameras, they're clicking away. And it was one of the most iconic moments for me. And it shaped my whole career. Because what I learned from that moment was the power of of politics, of media, of medicine, of psychology all colliding all at once in this moment that really did change pediatric HIV in this country. She made a series of visits, and it changed everything for children. Suddenly, the foster community decided, okay, we'll take a risk. We'll start taking these kids in. The nurses started, you know, getting a little more relaxed. People really rose to the challenge after that moment, and of course, the funding followed. So, you know, it's a very big problem. It's a global pandemic, but it's also one child at a time. And for me, that's been the arc of my career, because I've had the great fortune of being able to follow some of the children who were babies at Harlem Hospital, some of the children, most of the children who were born here at Boston Medical Center throughout their lifetimes. And I've learned everything from them. They've taught us what it means to help a child begin to understand what's happening when they're sick, how to take control of their illness. They've taught us a lot about the psychology of dealing with a chronic illness, of overcoming neurodevelopmental challenge. And now I think, you know, we've moved, obviously, as Pastan says, it's a story of hope. We've moved to hoping that these young people have long and productive lives, but they bear the wounds inside. They carry the stigma of discrimination, and they're struggling with adherence. And they have a lot to share with us in the adult world and in the scientific community, and they're just now finding their voice. Obviously, for someone like me, the global implications of our work are right at our front door here at Boston Medical Center. Many children coming from other countries. I became aware of that as a child from Uganda, came to our program. A woman who had founded a program there that we have partnered with, serving over 1,000 orphans and vulnerable children a day. We very much want to share with our colleagues in other countries and partner around knowledge exchange, particularly in the ways that we can build resilience in children and families. And it's the kids and the young adults now who are leading the way in that, and it's our job to facilitate that. So thank you. It's fun to share and think back, reflect a little bit.
That's great. Well, I think for me, it was before any training I'd ever had in any postgraduate education that I experienced AIDS for the first time. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa in a country called Burkina Faso. And AIDS was not a part of my world. I was 22. It was 1985. I didn't know, AIDS was not at all in my universe. I went to Burkina Faso, and I was a volunteer in a small town at the edge of the Sahel in the north of the country, towards the Sahara Desert. And it was a Francophone country, and I was a teacher of English as a foreign language, something I did not want to do, but that was my job. So I did a lot of other things, but agricultural work and things like that. But in the evenings, when I didn't want to speak French anymore, because it was really difficult for me to speak French, what I did was I'd go to my local restaurant where I would sit and have rice and sauce and maybe a beer or, you know, a nice brochette or something like that, and talk with the ladies who were cooking and serving drinks. And over time, over the course of going there often to eat, because I didn't like to cook, I got to be close friends with these women and would hang out with them, and we'd talk about what a lot of women talk about, hair, fashion, food, men. So, and in the background, there were articles and so on of this health problem going around, and SIDA. It was SIDA in Burkina Faso too, of course. And the women with whom I spent a lot of my evenings were also sex workers. And for them, even though we didn't know it yet, it was something that was very, very, it was their lives. And over the 2 years I was there, it became clear over time that these women were really recognizing their vulnerability to this virus or to the SIDA, and really it was very unclear about how HIV was transmitted. Could be through eating from the same bowl, from drinking from the same calabash, sharing, the beer or whatever it might be. So there was a lot of fear and a lot of stigma, and the early, I would say, the communication messages about transmission of HIV, a lot of them pictured women in short skirts and open blouses, often in the shape of a skeleton, who were out sort of preying on men, and they were embodied HIV, that these women had HIV in their bodies and they were spreading it. And this was the communication. This was what really was out there. I left Burkina Faso, and about a year later I entered graduate school, and I wanted to study ethnomedicine. I wanted to study anthropology, and I went in a medical anthropology program. And I thought, well, I'd waver between biological anthropology, where I was studying primatology, and medical anthropology, and I decided, well, I was probably more interested in humans than I was, in the end, in apes and other primates, other than humans. So I began to read the literature coming out, the scientific literature coming out on this HIV/AIDS epidemic. And I was curious of the language in the scientific literature, which was supposed to be objective. And the language that I was reading was about how sex workers, prostitutes, were vectors of the virus and spreading the virus to men, and then from men to their wives at home. And I kept thinking about my friends. Does the literature, is it complete? Is it really representing the full picture of complexity about how HIV is transmitted? And words like promiscuous are used in the scientific literature. And you can ask 100 people, what does the word promiscuous mean? And you'll get 100 different answers. It's not an objective scientific term, but used liberally in the scientific literature. And I found this very curious, and I realized that really we as, today even, we as scientists, we as researchers, come from a certain moral, social, cultural background, and what we write about is what we know. And that early literature, and even into today, does reflect that level of value-laden judgment on the transmission of HIV and who is to blame and who is innocent. So there's a lot of that language going around. I had the opportunity to do my master's work, to go to Bamako, Mali, where I did an ethnography of, I was so interested in this issue. I moved from ethnomedicine to studying HIV. So that was 1988. I just said, okay, I'm going to do HIV and sexual and reproductive health. And I went to Bamako and I did an ethnography of sex work in 2 different brothels. One which was fairly large, 75 women. The other was 10 women. Very different places, different women, different stories. I could sit here and talk about those stories forever. But one story in particular that I'd like to share is of a young woman who was quite smart and very assertive, and my question, I would ask about their lives and different aspects of their lives, some about health, but a lot about their families and their religious beliefs, their, education, whole range of things. So one woman in particular, I asked her, well, how did you come to this place where we were sitting in the brothel? And she said, well, I used to be a maid for a family in the city, and every day I'd get raped by both the father and the son in the family, and I wasn't paid very well, and they beat me. And I finally decided that I wasn't gonna do this anymore. And I found my way here to this place, the brothel. And I get to say who I have sex with, and I keep the money. And I get to run the show, basically. And she said, and I don't work as hard. And I earn way more money. So I think that to me, as a young woman of whatever I was, 27, hearing that and just sort of understanding that the decision making that goes on in different people's lives, it was really important for me. And the other story I wanted to tell you about that particular experience was that all the women in these brothels were tested for HIV by an organization very well known for doing work with HIV, very good work. But they were tested with HIV with a certain condition that they would be informed of their test results after they were tested. So they agreed to be tested. And when I went to find out, from the donor, will have these women being informed of the test results, they said no. The organization ran out of money, and so these women haven't been informed. And I thought, I was just sort of outraged, like who's looking out for the rights of these women? Who are their advocates? Don't they have the right to know? Nobody cared about that. It didn't matter. And so I think that really struck me as here are these organizations meaning to do good for the world, but at the same time really falling short of meeting the needs and requirements and fulfilling the rights of these very marginalized women. I want to fast forward. I know we gotta. Well, so that was just, and then I interviewed my first people I ever knew living with HIV, and came back 6 months later, and two of the women had passed away, and I didn't know they had HIV at the time I was interviewing them, but all the signs were there, and it was so in my face, and I didn't know, and it was such a shock to me. But anyway, I'll just fast forward to the one vignette about just working in Vietnam, where I've worked with drug users and sex workers, and one of our latest studies on with people living with HIV and looking at issues of discrimination, and we did a study. And I think one of the things that struck me about our work with those particular people, people living with HIV in a place where HIV is just sort of, maybe it's at 1% antenatal women, so it's a very low, concentrated epidemic. But that there was so much discrimination, and one of the things that came out in our work was that not only are people being told not to ever have sex again, but to never have children, even though antiretroviral therapy is available in the country, widely available in the country, and it is free. And reports of unknowingly being sterilized, women being sterilized, and unknowingly signing away that, and that basically they can no longer have children, and them recounting that they tried for so long to have children, and they didn't know they had been sterilized, and they finally went to the doctor and said, "We're trying and we can't have a child, can you help us?" And the doctor looking at the file and saying, "Well, you were sterilized when you had your baby." And that, knowing that. So I think, just to say that my arc has been from, this very personal experience and coming at it from friendship, not from work, but actually coming from a, you know, these women were my friends, to understand, to really sort of living the epidemic through their eyes in a way. And then my work now, which is much more sort of broader scope, and but really focusing on rights and those issues. And anyway, it's nice to again reflect on these issues.
I'm not a scientist, but I've been trained like one. If you hang out with public health people for more than 7 minutes, you are indoctrinated into a way of thinking and speaking that, frankly, you never can leave. The tragedy, I think, of forgetting where we've been is to watch the abuses of where we are. In the last 7 years, more than 80 countries have enacted arcane laws in the name of public health, which incarcerate women specifically for knowingly or unknowingly spreading a virus. If they seek to have an abortion, they are given the death penalty. If they produce a child who is HIV positive, they are given the death penalty. And this happens in countries with which the United States works on a daily basis. The tragedy of forgetting where we have been is it takes us back to where we currently are. AIDS for me began unknowingly, as you've kind of heard for all of us, in 1979 with the death of parishioners in my openly gay parish in Dallas, Texas. We had no names, but young gay men were dying of immune deficiencies of all kinds and producing bizarre diseases that had only been written about in the medical literature. I graduated from BU in 1974 to be a priest, and that's where I've lived my life. So this institution and I have a whole history around this stuff. In 1981, I'm probably one of the few people who knows exactly where he was when the MMWR report came out, because we sat at breakfast that morning, my then partner epidemiologist and I, and discussed that didn't those cases sound a lot like the 4 people I'd already buried since 1979. 1984 is the first anecdote. I had been sent to Dallas and had gone into a new parish, and a young man covered in Kaposi sarcoma, that cancer that was described by Don at the very beginning, with also an active case of tuberculosis, and looking more like he was 108 instead of 28. And we all have our first one, and we always know the name, don't we? Yeah. Notice we didn't tell you all of that. But his name was Jerome. And he asked me the question that would change my life. May I die in your church? And his intention that day was to commit suicide. Instead, I invited him into a community of people, many of whom were gay. And he came to believe in life, and he died 6 months later. But not before 180 members of that church walked out as a whole when they realized who he was and how sick he was, all seeking to escape the epidemic. When we forget our history, we actually can't articulate the present. The decision I made for him to live with us and for us to live with him created a buddy project. It created the Dallas AIDS Interfaith Network. It created the Dallas AIDS Arms Network, which was part of the original Robert Wood Johnson City study of what we would do to respond in any social sense to this disease. There were no cures. I was recruited by CDC in 1984 when I called and said, I think we've got HIV in our parish, and it didn't have a name. In fact, its name then was HTLV3. Do you remember that one? I didn't even know what it was, but my epidemiologist partner explained the science behind it, and I never forgot it. But I didn't understand AIDS. I didn't understand virology, and what I later learned is much of the scientific world didn't understand virology either. HIV, in a sense, gave birth to a whole new generation of virologists who would turn the world upside down and would eventually help create treatments that were virtually unimaginable 30 years ago. And so there's been good things, but if we forget where we've been, we can't even celebrate the achievement of where we are. My former partner is one of the world's longest-term survivors, now in his 36th year of infection, having been a director of the PEPFAR program in Kenya, and now being the director of the AIDS program in the Peace Corps. And so, see, it all comes back around, doesn't it? We all go back to where we started. I was in that parish. We created so many things that would break new ground that it got the attention of government, as it always does in these things. And in 1988, after 150 deaths in my church, 150 funerals that I really don't like living through in my mind, but still come back to me, and their names are still imprinted on me, C. Everett Koop invited me into the U.S. Public Health Service. I had no training and I didn't belong. My job was to make nice with some of the hardest AIDS states in America because they really were separate countries in America. They're called Louisiana and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico. And in each of those were native populations. So immediately I got caught up in the work of Native Americans who actually couldn't say the word HIV or death because death cannot be spoken of out loud with the elders. And I had to break tribal taboo to persuade the elders that we actually had to talk about sex and death in the same breath. And this was a shocking taboo. But as a priest, they allowed me to do that because they knew that I knew something about the sacred. From that world, I also was involved in the South African freedom struggle through the 80s and through my acquaintance and work with Desmond Tutu and his chief of staff Njongonkulu Ndungane, who became the Archbishop of Cape Town in 1996. I was then invited to go to sub-Saharan Africa, to the Church of Southern Africa with its 10 million Anglicans in 9 countries, virtually the Horn of Africa, and virtually the epicenter of the epidemic. And I was invited then to build an AIDS program out of nothing. I'm very good at creating things out of nothing, so that's probably why I'm Director of Development at the School of Theology. I'm both raising the dead and raising money all at the same time. But in that work, the signal moment that summarized almost everything you've heard on this panel came from the woman who made this little AIDS ribbon in the final weeks of her life. And this is how she paid for her funeral, but could not pay for her burial. Her name was Nesta. At 38 years of age, she had 2 children, aged 11 and 10, and I met her in the Peace Train Tavern in the Valley of 1,000 Hills outside of Durban. They call it the Valley of 1,000 Hills because each of the mud huts just looks like another little part of the hill. And when your eye looks over these places, you think, there's just a lot of little hills out here. And so there were 1,000 of them, and it sat literally under the watch of one of the most famous polo clubs in all of Africa on the top of the hill. At the Peace Train Tavern, women gathered each day in a tavern that had gone broke because its owner had died of AIDS, and his wife said, "We will do something to benefit people here." And these women gathered daily to decide who would get respite care, who would get to lay down for 8 hours with others in attendance. Laying down in this place meant laying on a wooden bed, quite literally, covered in newspapers, but having a few moments of just being free from the terror of surviving on a day-to-day basis. And the other women would bathe the one in bed and feed her and care for her. And at sundown, they would all walk back to their homes. This lottery of sorrow took place 7 days a week. And in it, I was invited to come. I met Nesta, and I had brought some food up from one of the village projects farther down in the valley, and shared the food among all the women at the Peace Train that day. And then I noticed Nesta was having difficulty. She couldn't walk because her Kaposi sarcoma had manifested in massive lesions, causing her legs to swell to a level where she couldn't walk. And so I offered to take her back down the road, since she'd walked 8 kilometers to this place. And we took her back, and when we got to the place where she lived, I noticed that she was sobbing because her pain was so great, and I offered to carry her groceries to her cottage. Actually, it was a mud hut. And she said, "I'm really ashamed for you to see this, but I need help." And I said, "I'm not here to judge your property. I'll just walk with you." So we walked down the hill, deposited the groceries, and she said, "Would you like to see my children?" And I was kind of curious, and I said, "Sure." And she took me out behind the house, and there were 3 mounds of earth covered in branches, and these were 3 primitive graves, mostly above the ground. And she explained that she had to dig these for her 2 baby children, one that died at 1 year and the other that died at 2.5. And that the 3rd large mound was for her husband, who had brought his HIV home from Johannesburg from working in the mines, and from his city wife, shared it with his wife in the country. I was aghast. I'd really never seen graves above ground, covered in thorn branches to keep the dogs and the goats from digging away at the grave. And I asked her how come this happened, and she said, "We're so poor, I was ashamed. And so I buried my family under the cloak of darkness." And there I did my work, and I said, "And who will take care of you?" She said, "My 2 grown children, 10 and 11, who were born before I was infected, they will bury me." All I could do was stand in silence with this woman. And then I asked, "Have these ever been blessed?" And she said, "No one of religion ever comes here." And so I knelt down and started blessing each of these graves as if it had been the day of the funeral, because it's all I knew how to do. I'm just a priest. And as I did that, she fell to the earth and started pounding the earth, and particularly her husband's grave, with the words, "Where were you? Where were you when they came and stole all our belongings the night you died? Where were you when our children were taken to a school far away? Where were you?" And she sobbed, and as she sobbed, I picked her up and held her, and she started beating my chest, saying, "Where were you?" And I knew in that moment that she was saying something to the whole world, as all women around the world say it. Where were you when I could have been protected and you didn't do the research? Where were you when my rights as a woman were compromised by the man I love? Where were you when my children died and there was no one to bury them? Nesta lives with me because this ribbon hangs on me every day. I wish I could say I have lived one day in the last 35 years without AIDS, but I can't say that. As I recited my list of prayers again this morning, I could still name a dozen people whom I call and write and share life with. What's different is that they're still alive. They're still with us. And what's changed is Jerome's question, may I die in your church, has now turned to a harder question which health systems are struggling with. May I live in your care? To that response, I did the work on decent care with the Ford Foundation. In response to the work I did at WHO on the 3x5, bringing 3 million people into treatment by the end of 2005, under the leadership of Jim Kim, who'd come to us from Partners in Health. And Jim's answer to everything is, if we build it, they will come. Well, they did. But my concern was, where's the decency? What we did learn, and what you've heard from each one of us, is there was a certain quality of empathy and support that caused the medical community to break out of its earlier norms of distance. We actually touched and held the people who were sick. And we walked a journey of compassion that changed our lives and moved us to a much deeper place in the human experience. That was getting lost because all we could now do is just throw medication. My plea to you is, even though the technology is here to turn a lot of this around, what has shaped it for so many is the human compassion of standing whole even in the face of tremendous loss, and of standing fast with people who were most afraid that we would walk away. Thank you.
Wow. Let me open it up to the floor for both comments or other people's reflections or questions for the respondents. Project so the room can hear.
We could probably do the mic.
Yeah. You all have your own anecdote or story that has obviously driven you. But I think something that seems to be hard is how you separate that, and do you separate that from doing some of your work done in research and being driven and separating those stories and that emotion out and actually doing the research when it's difficult, or Martha doing the clinical work that you do and right down the line? And do you separate that emotion out? Do you deposit those stories somewhere and let those drive you, or how do you deal with that?
Down the line.
I'll take a crack at that. No, you can't separate out those stories. You can't separate out the names of the people that you knew and that you held. That's what drives you. That's what keeps you going. That's what sustains you when you're up at 3 o'clock in the morning, in my case, writing a grant or doing some of the things about the work that we do that aren't so much fun and aren't so interesting. But when it looks really bleak and you've got a lot of hurdles to get over, it's the babies, it's the dying gay men, it's the sex workers that you absolutely have to keep both right in front of you and in your heart. Otherwise, I would have given up a long time ago.
Or to go on? Okay. And I would say, psychologists, a lot of our training is in how to kind of channel one's own emotional reactions. And that phase that I was talking about in New York, I was pregnant with my first child. The women that I was working with were the same age I was. And I found that That gave me great strength. That gave me a way in that I would never have had otherwise, because I was all about mothering. And to be able to help other women, do that the best they could under the circumstances they were in was incredibly empowering for me as a professional, and I hope, for the women and families I served. And as I've watched children grow up, I think that, the capacity to listen, as you would listen to your own child, and learn. And it's not always easy, adolescents aren't easy, but they are amazing in their capacity. And what we're finding now is, with an open heart, with the capacity to roll with their emotions and respect their emotions, and as I said, learn from them, we now have the ability to take those lessons learned and hopefully have them matter for new children. The past. We're learning from the past in order to inform the future. And there's nothing more rewarding professionally than that, or personally. It's the same thing.
Yeah, for me, I can't separate it, but I think a lot about accountability. Who are we accountable to? And yeah, we're accountable to our donors. We're accountable to the IRB. We're accountable to to Boston University. But really we're accountable to the people who are vulnerable, infected, affected, and how we're accountable to being facilitators and assistants, and as people living with HIV and people affected and people vulnerable, actually I would say we're all vulnerable, take on the role of the actors in the response. It's like, how are we engaging? And so I think that's the issue of accountability, I think is right there all the time.
I guess it's always been about memory. It's the business I am in, I guess. The memory of all of these people is so deeply imprinted, I can't even imagine anymore what it would be like not to carry them. What's behind your question, though, is did the loss incapacitate us, or does the memory of loss really incapacitate us? And I think you've heard the answer loud and clear. Of course not. If anything, it burns a passion from which you cannot go away. I have been trying to work in anything else but HIV for 34 of the 35 years I've done it. And the fact is, I am utterly accountable no matter where I am. And the fact that my world never doesn't include HIV at some level, and that I can't escape it, what it has done is sharpen my focus on what's not working. And for me, I had to tell the history of all the caregiving we built in those early years and called it decent care, because it is and it was decent, and use that as a standard against which to judge healthcare systems and say, if people untrained could create something this dynamic, why do we doubt the ability of human beings to create health and health systems that produce life? What are we missing here? And again, for me, it was discovering the history of Alma-Ata in 1978, when a group of people from around the world in the World Health Organization came together in Kazakhstan, of all places, and said this amazing thing: it is the right and the responsibility of people to operate and manage their own health care and health care systems. They said that, and we have never seen it happen. There's a reason. And health educators are needed. So there is this deep accountability, not just to remember what we suffered, but to build something better so that that doesn't happen that way again.
Lana?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for your stories. I think I can probably say for everyone here, they were amazing, and I've never heard anything quite like that. I guess I was really interested, Dr. Thea, your comment on when you first encountered it and how somebody said to you, this is a developed world problem. It's not really going to be an issue in Africa. And of course, that didn't turn out to be the case. And then I've been a sexual health educator now for a couple of years, particularly among college students. And the thought process that I've encountered has been, this is not our issue. And even if it is, it's not a death sentence anymore. So not really an issue to think about prevention, to think about how this is still a problem, a major problem here in the U.S. And I guess what I'm curious to know is, for those of us who don't have these amazing, like first encounter stories that can make anybody sort of rethink how they frame this disease, how do you suggest to us to proceed to bring the realization back into the U.S.? What populations or what stories should we be looking for that will really make this have an impact again? I think we're all sort of desensitized, and we hear about it too much almost. So what are your suggestions?
Number one, read the MMWR and check the health statistics. What's happened in this world is case rates in the U.S. are often worse than any place we've ever been in Africa. I can take you down around one of our military encampments in North Carolina, and in that county, the HIV incidence rate is higher than anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. But the level of denial, and because it's happening to women of color who are poor, it doesn't register on the national radar the way other things do. Those numbers are right here. They're not over there. And I've been calling on CDC for the last 3 years to say, I think you need to start a new domestic mission on HIV. I appreciate the work in Africa, but you've missed the point. And what we see is that in America, this disease, not only is it about gay men and their changing sexual patterns, but it's also about people who always sit at the bottom of the social ladder. The poor, the underprivileged, the children, the women, people of color. It happens that way, and people who do drugs. And when you ask the average member of our population in this country, are you interested in helping any of these people? The answer comes across, not terribly. Don't they just eat up health care in the public health system? Isn't this why we had to get health care reform? To just sort of take care of them, except they're still falling through the net. And what has never happened is a legitimate, and I say this as a mass indictment really, a legitimate prevention program that takes seriously how people behave and how they actually live. And as long as we categorize life and abstain, be faithful, use condoms, whatever that's supposed to mean. I come out of the church. Abstain is what you do for a reason for a season. It was what people did in family planning. Abstinence was used as a tool. So when people went around Africa saying abstain, they thought, okay, for a reason, for a season, we can do this. Or I abstain Monday through Friday. It had no meaning. Be faithful, which one and to whom on what day? I am always faithful to my city wife when I'm in town, and I'm always faithful to my country wife when I'm at home. And if I'm not faithful, it's because they've given me permission not to worry about that. So the words had no meaning. So a legitimate prevention campaign that really reaches into the hearts of people. Ask your peers what motivates them, and then build a prevention program that speaks to that. If you wonder how hard that is, we've had a half a century of smoking cessation in this country. Do people still smoke? If you don't believe me, go up to Berklee College of Music and stand on the street from 7 in the morning until midnight. Everybody smokes. And to add to that, smoking, as pleasurable it is, still isn't as good as sex. And so the reality is we're dealing with the most pleasurable behavior that humans are capable of producing. And we're telling people, wrap it, put it in plastic, lay it in latex, and then have a good time. And oh, by the way, could you take some antiretrovirals before you have sex? I'm sorry, but we have a message that literally can't be lived out, and we have to really work a whole lot harder in speaking to the hearts of people.
To the side here.
Thank you very much for coming out. Part of what's so interesting about this talk is that between the four of you, we have something like over 100 years of experience.
Wish you hadn't said that.
Well, what's amazing is that you've played a part in creating something out of nothing, from the beginning of HDLV3 to today, which we've seen a lot of amazing progress, you know. But what interests me as a hopeful future public healther is maybe a question of looking back over your 30 years in this. What's something that you would have done differently, or chosen to go a different route, or spent more time on while you were going through it, looking back on it now? And then what's something that you may have felt was a risk at the time, or that you didn't necessarily know if it was going to pan out, but some gut feeling or something, and then you've seen it pay off? And then if you still have time for a third question.
Let's take those two, give the panel a chance to respond quickly to those two, and then take a couple more questions because we're getting close on time. So what would you have done different?
I think that, actually, I think this answers both those questions. I wish that when I had first gotten to Vietnam in 1998, I was very much focused on sexual and reproductive health. I wish that I had really gotten it through my thick head that injecting drug use was really the thing I needed to convince the Ford Foundation to deal with in this particular context. And so, and that I think is, and then eventually I was able to, one, I had to sort of figure it out myself. I didn't know anything about injecting drug users. You know, I'd worked in sexual health, you know, HIV in relation to sexual transmission. So I had to really, I'd like, you know, learn a lot. And not a lot known. But then I was able to support, being lucky enough to be in a position where I could do that, support some really groundbreaking work in harm reduction and developing partnerships between government and scientists, and really saying to the Vietnamese and convincing the Vietnamese authorities that, you know, if you give us a chance, let's just try it. We'll get evidence. If it doesn't work, if it works though, we have another tool. And so I think that that really encapsulates and really what both of those things. And I think the one thing that really stands out in my head is that went up to northern Vietnam, where I was in the mountains and meeting in the party chief, you know, and meeting with him and his colleagues, and all the sectors were represented, and trying to sort of make the case, let's do it, you know, let's try it. And he recognized the problem, and it was, we didn't really know where we were going, and whether we had a yes or a no, whether we're going to get this, try this harm reduction work. And walked out of the meeting, and I'm walking to the car, and I'm about ready to get in the car, and the chief of police and his deputy come up to me and said, "Dr. Lisa." And I thought, oh my God, you know, the police, you know, what are they going to, you know, uh-oh. And they said, you know, I have one question for you. And I was like, oh, geez, what is it? And he said, when can we start? And after that, it was like, really? And I was like, okay, let's go. And it was just a matter, I was in the right place at the right time. I was one little cog in the wheel that were, working with other cogs in the wheel that were able to jumpstart something really new and very controversial, but willing to take the chance to test it. And guess what? It worked. Incidents went plummeted, and we actually were able to show through evidence that it works. And guess what? The Vietnamese government, now it's part of national law. It's now legal. Harm reduction, needle syringe distribution is legal. That was a...
Others?
I think what I would have done differently if I had been older, and if I had been in my 50s then, I would have pushed a lot harder on the mental health front, because, often we work in the shadow of the research dollars and the medical leadership, and that's wonderful because it creates partnerships that can be successful. But too often, mental health, early education, these things that are desperately important in people's lives are secondary. They're secondary in the funding world. They're secondary agenda. They're the last chapter in the manual, and they're the most important thing for keeping people adherent with medication. How you feel about yourself, how good you are at recognizing what's happening and being an advocate for yourself. Those skills, which we learn as children, are very, very important in fighting this epidemic. And it's only now that I feel like I finally have, my voice and I can be heard. And I'm finding it very satisfying to work in the field of early childhood. And I would put a pitch out there for those of you interested in the public health arena. Think about early childhood. If you can make a difference before a child is 5 in the way they think about themselves or the way their parent approaches that child, you can make a huge impact. And this is one of the biggest tools we have in destigmatizing HIV, is getting early childhood centers in villages all over the world to normalize the language of HIV and teach it to children, because they will help us break through those barriers.
The only thing that I'd like to add to that is, I think what I would have done differently is I would have become an advocate a lot earlier in my career. And I remember distinctly first resisting and then being deeply impressed with the power of the gay community in the United States and how they were able to very effectively push the FDA and push the NIH to really come around and make some major changes in the way medicine is practiced, the way research is done, and the way drugs are approved in this country. And if I had to do it all over again, I would have joined much earlier in my career in being an advocate for politicizing this disease.
Ooh. Because all I've been is an activist. I think I don't have any regrets because I can't afford them at this point in my life. When I look at the career, though, I never intended a public health career, and I never intended to be a Fed on and off. And what I did learn from the experience of being a federal official was, while I could leverage things under the rules of legislation, my hands were tied to be the advocate I was. And I was actually muted and silent, which I learned later was part of a larger plan to keep me silent, because I was fighting pitched battles with federal officials at the point I was brought into the Public Health Service. The same thing happened to me again at WHO, curiously, is that when you go into an international health agency controlled, in this case, by 119 governments, Voice is one of the things that you lose. That's the price of admission to be in that stage. And free thinking is not encouraged. And so I actually had to find ways of subverting the system to get the voices of the people heard, and I was able to do that. But it's something, because public health is often perceived merely as a government function, the very thing that drives us to being engaged in public health might be the very thing that keeps us from getting it done. And that's bureaucratic systems and governance, which can silence the spirited thinkers among us and the good voices, and actually compromise our space and compromise the message.
Do we have one last? We'll take one last question and then we'll wrap up. Or comment.
Hi, thank you all for coming. It was very interesting. I just had a question on your experience with ethnic groups. I know that sometimes the dynamics, I used to be a peer educator for the Asian community, and the dynamics are sometimes different, the way to reach out to them, prevention, adherence, and I just was wondering, and even trends, like the rate, whether it's faster or not. That's my question.
Yeah.
The whole message, I think, and I want to kind of expand on that, is your question starts with, so what about differences in ethnicity? Absolutely, but there are some universals that I've actually come to understand. It is taboo in every culture to talk about sex and death. Let's start with that one. It is taboo in every culture to actually be explicit about sex and death, and many cultures have no language to describe sex and death. This creates some inherent challenges if you are doing outreach. What I've had to learn, and I think it's safe to say we've all had to learn it because of the venues in which we did the work. If you don't believe that the voice of the people who are on site is the authentic voice of authority, you miss the point completely. All of us have had to go into alien and different settings, and there we've had to negotiate what it was our message would be. But in that messaging, if we do not convey respect and dignity and acknowledge the power of the leadership in that room, we will walk out failures every time. For me, the experts became the ladies under a tree in the Transky who explained to me what HIV actually was, because I'd spent all of these years learning a proper language of science and doing all the equivocation that goes with the explanation. And they said, this virus is a virus that creates death from the very stuff of life. And it takes all of the fluids that would create and sustain and reinforce and preserve life, and it turns them into vehicles of death. Is there something else we need to know about HIV? And everybody there knew exactly what was being discussed. It's learning to trust that deep wisdom of women and children who know their world, such as it is, and will give you the words and the tools to tell them the story that you want to tell.
I think also, in response to your question, HIV isn't really special in that regard. When trying to get to populations that are different than your own, it's axiomatic in public health that you start at the ground level, that you use the people to whom you're trying to communicate these messages as the source of the way to get the message across to them. And I don't think that it really is particular to HIV. It goes across the board with any kind of a public health message in a culture that's different than your own.
We're 30 years in. The reality is you haven't missed the boat. We'll be 30 years going. This is a a disease which will be with us. We've learned a tremendous amount. There are commonalities, as Don says, that are not HIV specific, but there are differences, as Ted has said, that HIV, sex, and death are more difficult than smoking cessation and whatnot. So we live in a time where we will continue to confront the pandemic. And remember, the pandemic is made up of multiple epidemics in these different ethnicities, in these different populations, in these different groups. And in that, there is room for a variety of people with skills and interests to bring their expertise to bear. So that 30 years from now, I look forward to sitting on that side of the room and hearing your stories of how you've confronted and built a professional life. So with that, I want to thank you for coming tonight. And I want to thank the respondents and panelists particularly for speaking and sort of giving us your stories. And I want to thank Casey and Corey and Scott and the others from the CGH team and the others who helped them for helping put this together. So thank you very much and good night.